Better Dead Than Zed, it's NES Works episode 45. Rygar was not an isolated case. Tecmo took a shallow arcade game and transformed it into a proper exploratory action RPG for NES, and that home conversion would stand out as one of the most ambitious and surprising localizations of all time, if not for the fact that it was basically just the beginning of what would become business as usual. Case in point, the very next chronological release for NES, Capcom's Section Z, or Section Z as it's called in Japan. The surface of Section Z for NES looks like a reasonable, if not exacting, conversion of the coin-op source material, but it distinguishes itself as something different altogether almost immediately. Section Z does make Rygar appear to be an aberration in one sense, though. That was the only one of the recent influx of deeper, more complex NES releases for 1987 not to have gotten its start on Famicom Disk System. On the other hand, like CASTLEVANIA and Kid Icarus, Section Z debuted in Japan as a diskette. So Rygar's card-only nature makes it the weird kid in class. Please note that I've recorded footage for this episode primarily from the Japanese release rather than the American version. See, as with Castlevania, Section Z allowed players to save their progress in Japan, and Capcom dropped that feature altogether for the US. The Disk System version had a little loading time before secret rooms, and the sound effects had a little extra zip. Besides that, the two games were otherwise pretty much identical. But the loss of a save feature is a pretty big deal here. Castlevania was a fairly manageable game to complete even without the save feature because it was only 6 stages long. Finishing the US release of Section Z, on the other hand, is one of the NES's more demanding challenges. To understand why that is, it's worth looking at the arcade version of Section Z and appreciating just how different this conversion ended up being. About all these two games have in common is auto-scrolling combat that allows players to fire forward and backward, and the idea of an enemy fortress being broken into sections labeled by an alphanumeric code. The coin-op version was extremely straightforward. The unnamed protagonist jetted forward in a vertical scrolling zone, and every few screens a marker would appear to chart their progress through those zones, A, B, C, etc. Once you reached Section E, the scrolling changed direction and the action became a vertical shooter, sort of. The hero could still only fire left and right, so instead of firing ahead into the direction of the screen's motion, you were firing laterally. The auto-scrolling changes direction in the arcade version a few times, so that ultimately you trace out a huge box before moving into the final run to take down the boss, L-Brain, in Section Z. It's a challenging game, what with it being a Capcom shooter, but a reasonably interesting one. The defining gimmick to Section Z, even more so than its alphanumeric progression tracking, is that, as mentioned before, the hero can fire forward and backward. This isn't like the tailgun in Gradius or something. Section Z gives players 2 buttons, one to fire and one to rotate the spaceman's aim 180 degrees. When enemies approach from behind, you can rotate to face them and shoot them down by pressing the proper button to change your orientation. It takes some real getting used to, and it's kind of clumsy. Capcom would greatly improve on this concept in Section Z's spiritual successors, Sidearms and Forgotten Worlds. But players didn't have to wait that long. The NES port makes the control scheme feel a lot more reasonable too. Rather than using the fire and rotate setup, Section Z on NES simply dedicates a different firing function to each face button. A allows the hero, apocryphally named Captain Commando by Capcom's US office in an attempt to create a mascot character for the company, to fire forward to the right. B causes the good captain to flip immediately backward and fire to his left. This arrangement feels instantly intuitive and immediately makes the home version of Section Z more approachable and fun than the coin-op rendition. The only awkwardness comes from the secondary weapon feature. In order to activate the extra weapons you acquire along the way, you have to press both fire buttons at once, and it doesn't always trigger cleanly. The control scheme is only the beginning of the changes Section Z experienced on NES though. It's fundamentally a different game from the arcade version, as distinct from its source material as Mighty Bomb Jack or Rygar. The arcade's environment consisted of a single twisting path through an underground tunnel, broken into 26 zones designated by signage. The NES game, on the other hand, is broken up into 60 separate mini-stages, all arranged by numbers from 0 to 59. This means the name Section Z ceases to have any actual meaning here, but oh well. The NES game also sticks exclusively to horizontal auto-scrolling, which actually works in its favor. The zones you encounter vary wildly in nature. Some advance at lightning speed and become panicked tests of reflex, while others creep along slowly and turn into endurance-centered challenges. Most are packed with enemies, whose attacks range from aimless drifting to hateful hit-and-run bursts of bullets that fill the screen. The majority of stages contain hidden items or secret exits to bonus rooms where the captain can collect power-ups or special items. And at the end of each zone, you encounter the exit gates. It's here that Section Z truly distinguishes itself from the arcade original. The 2 or 3 gates you encounter at the end of every zone in the game are kind of like a digital choose-your-own-adventure book. Do you take the top gate, the bottom gate, the rare and intimidating middle gate? Each gate you see connects to a different zone. Some will lead you to new rooms, while others will send you hurtling backward to a previously explored area. Consider the 2 gates at the end of Section 1. The top one leads to Section 2, while the bottom gate leads to Section 3. The gates in Section 3 lead to Sections 4 and 6. And one of the gates in Section 4 will take you right back to Section 1. In other words, Section Z has mutated into a massive 60-room labyrinth on NES. A space maze where plotting and navigating your course through the world becomes as challenging as simply surviving the onslaught of enemies leading up to each set of gates. This is probably the most complex game we've seen on NES, as the entire adventure consists of an interlocking pathway an order of magnitude more complicated than the fortresses of Kid Icarus. Thankfully, Capcom's designers revised the mechanics here so that Captain Commando no longer dies instantly from the slightest scratch. Otherwise, this game would go from incredibly difficult to impossible. Instead, the captain starts out with 20 stamina points, and he loses 1 point each time an enemy projectile connects. Physical impacts, on the other hand, pose a greater challenge. If a bad guy body checks the captain, he's stunned, returned to the beginning of the current section, and docked 5 hit points. When Captain Commando's hit points reach 0, the real fun begins. And by fun, I mean hellish punishment. Run out of stamina, and you're cast back to the beginning of the current region of the game. Section Z is broken into 3 regions of 20 stages apiece. The game begins in Section 0, and until you defeat the mid-boss in Section 19 and advance to the second region, you're sent back to Section 0 any and every time you run out of health. This is not the same as a game over, thankfully. Any critical progress you've made along the way, including unlocking the red gates that block your forward advancement, are retained when you revert to Section 0. Still, it can be a huge setback to be returned to the start of the game with a mere 20 hit points. But once you learn the lay of the land, you don't have to pass through all 20 zones of a region in order to return to the mini-boss for a rematch. For example, the most direct route to the first boss is a mere 7 stages long. It's not a cakewalk precisely, but the levels here are so short, it only takes a few minutes to return and challenge the boss again. Once you beat mini-bosses, you move along to the next region, and falling in combat will then return you to the initial section of that region, rather than flinging you back to Section 0. So there are absolute points of no return in the game that help ease the pain of a loss. The Japanese disk system version saves your progress at these checkpoints, which makes exploring the later regions far less toilsome. Saving on disk system also records your current weapon stock loadout, as well as the permanent health upgrades you earn from the mini-bosses who have to be destroyed in order to open red gates. It makes a huge difference to be able to boot the game directly into Section 20 or Section 40, rather than having to complete the first region afresh in every session. And the loss of the disk system's save feature really turns the NES conversion into a slog. It's really a shame Capcom didn't offer any sort of password feature or continue code to allow players to retain their progression across sessions in the US, because it's the one real black mark on what is otherwise a fascinating and high-minded take on the shooter genre. We've only seen a handful of shooters on NES, and already here's one that turns the format sideways in a bold way. Compared to Rygar and Kid Icarus, Captain Commando's power-up potential is fairly limited and fleeting. You can gain special weapons, speed boosts, laser upgrades, barriers, health max-ups, and a few other goodies, but many of these are expendable. That said, this overhaul of Section Z feels a lot like a game we haven't quite encountered yet, Nintendo's Metroid. While Metroid didn't ship until the month following Section Z here in the States, it debuted in Japan nearly a full year before Section Z did. More than enough time for Capcom's dev team to take a few notes from that revolutionary work. I'm sure some of the connections are coincidental, like the fact that the final boss in each game is a cybernetic brain, but there's something about the two games that feels very much of a piece with one another. From the design of mini enemies, to the electric barriers that protect bosses, to the exploratory feel of the two secret packed journeys. And, there's probably a bit of Namco's Baraduk in here, too. One thing Section Z definitely doesn't owe to any other game is its amazing soundtrack, which has a sort of down-tempo Spy Guy groove to it. Maybe the 60s spy caper feel is meant to reflect the fact that this mission is impossible. In any case, Section Z feels like a major milestone for Capcom as a developer, a radical overhaul of an arcade game designed to better fit the nature of a home console. Whether or not these reinventions were mandated by Nintendo, Capcom did a great job with Section Z that, as with Rygar, heralds the company as a top-flight NES developer. Capcom's come a long way from being the publisher responsible for the NES version of 1942, and all in less than a year's time. Like a lot of other games of 1987, Section Z has largely been pushed aside in the collective conscience in favor of later, greater works, but it deserves canonization all the same. Next on NES Works, a brief respite from greatness before Nintendo reinvents video games twice.